Hi, everybody. This video is meant to get you started in Illustrator on your self-care pair container and packaging project. So the goal of this video is to show you how to do black and white line work using mostly pen tool, but maybe also some shape tools in Illustrator starting from a sketch. So let's get to it. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so here I have some early sketching, pretty rough on the project, and I wanted to create something that would make for a good demo. So I developed this kind of more mass market concept here that has a plastic housing and flip top cap, but allows for some interesting pen tool graphics. It's also a symmetric design because I wanted to show you guys how to do that. So I took this into Photoshop and separated out one sketch just in front view that I'm going to use in Illustrator. So here I have Illustrator. I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to choose from the presets up here in print and letter size. Because I have a mostly vertical concept, I'm going to do portrait orientation. So that looks good to me, and I'm going to hit create. Here I have a blank document. I'm going to hide my controls here. So workspace I have as Essentials Classic. That gives me all of the tools. A couple things I want to do here before getting started. I want to go to View and turn on my rulers. Show rulers. You'll notice that you have tick marks up at the top and the side. So this is in points, which is what we set up our file as, but it could be pixels or inches or metric, right? Millimeters, centimeters. If that is your preference, you can change that by right-clicking on the ruler. We're not really going to use these, but we are going to use guides. So I'm going to have that shown here. So I'm going to drag in that sketch that I cleaned up from my computer. And I'm going to center it on the page, at least for now. I'm going to hold Shift as I scale it, just to get that into the right position. At this stage, you can rotate it if you need to. Mine looks close enough. I think it's good enough to work with for our purposes. So once you get that into a good position, you can go ahead and lock that layer right next to that eyeball there. I'm going to create a new layer. Now, actually, before I do that, I'm just going to drop the opacity of this. So that's right at the top there. I'm going to take that down to maybe 30% or so. The reason that I do that is because I don't want this to compete with the stroke weight if I'm going to use a black stroke on future layers. So drop the opacity, now lock the layer. You can rename that if you choose just by double-clicking. Underlay sketch, and this I'll make line work. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're highlighting that new layer, and you can zoom in by either clicking or dragging left and right to get that into a good position. And V on the keyboard gets you back to that main selection arrow. A refresher, V on the keyboard is a way to select entire objects. A on the keyboard right next to it is the white arrow. That is for selecting paths and anchor points. So we're going to be using those quite a bit in this demo. All right, so I'll go to V, and I want to drag a guide. So you can do that by clicking and holding on the ruler either to the left of the canvas or the top of the canvas, dragging either over from the side or down from the top to give yourself a guide to work with. Guides are specific to layers. So if I turn off my layer here, I'm also turning off that guide. So keep that in mind as you're working. All right, so the guide should lock by default, but you can control these or unlock them by going to View, Guides, and you have some settings here. So that'll become important if you guys have symmetric concepts. Okay, so I can now proceed. So I'm going to hit P on the keyboard, or third one down from the left over here to get to pen tool. And I'm going to start from the middle and try to end in the middle. So with pen tool, if you click and release, you are creating a corner. If you click and hold, you're creating a smooth transition in your line work. So if you hover over the guide, you should be able to see that show up there in the center. I'm going to click and release because I want that to be a corner. Click and release somewhere around here because I want this also to be a corner. And then I'm going to click and hold over here to make a smooth transition on my side wall here. If you hold shift as you're doing this, it'll snap to either vertical or horizontal, which can be handy for creating tangency. And now I'm working my way up the concept. I'll click and release to create another corner. And here I'm going to click and hold because I have a curve on the top. So I can control that. I'm going to stop there. So I'll hit escape on the keyboard or my arrow key here to get out of that line that I've created. And you can see that this has created a filled shape. It's white in the middle, but I have a black stroke wherever I've created the stroke. It's still an open shape. I don't have a black stroke in the middle here. And that's good because I'm going to be reflecting this over to the other side, and I actually don't need a line in the middle. One thing that happens though, if you have a fill shape on here, is it's actually blocking the sketch underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, make it transparent and fill. So I have that fill color at the top here. So I'm going to hit none for fill. If I wanted to manipulate the stroke, I can click on that stroke to bring that up to the top. By clicking the swap, you can switch them, right? Now I have no stroke and I have black fill. So keep that in mind when you're working because that could come in handy. So I have a black stroke, weight of, let's see here, stroke weight of 1 point, which is good for now. And that is in the right position. I can switch over to my white arrow because now I want to manipulate individual corners. And you can see that there's this circular cursor at these two edges. So I can pull that in to create a rounded corner. Both become highlighted automatically, but if I want to control one at a time, I just click off to deselect and then click back on to reselect the corner in question. So it looks like in my design, I have a more generous fillet towards the bottom and a much softer one up at the top. So that looks pretty good. The other thing I could do at this stage is fine tune my design. So originally I had this pretty symmetric, a nice gradual soft curve, but I can add a little bit of tension at this point just by moving my line work, right? So I don't have to be perfectly faithful to my sketch if I want to play around a little bit with the aesthetics at this stage, right? I can kind of shift this up to the top if I want a little bit more tension up there. I can add a recurve, right? I can change some of these proportions in the design if I wanted to fine tune it at that point, right? So I encourage you guys to play around with your pen tool line work and don't feel like you have to stay rigidly committed to your underlay. Okay, so that's my main silhouette. I can move on to some other details. It looks like this is part of an ellipse or could be part of an ellipse. So I'll use my shape tool over here, click and hold over to select the ellipse. If I click on my guide, I can start from my guide. I can hold Alt to scale from the center. So that is pretty handy. Once that's in here, I can go back to my selection tool for my object and adjust some of these proportions. Again, fine tune. Alt scales from the middle, so you can do symmetric scaling just by holding Alt, which I'm doing right now. The other thing you could do, if you had made this shape off axis, you can highlight the center point and drag that back over to the guide, and it should snap to the guide. So that looks like it's in a good position. Right now, I'm only working on the half. So what that means is I'm working on one side, and I'm not worried about keeping symmetry at this point by doing the entire object. I can work on one half, and then when I'm done working on that, I can reflect it to the other side. So right now I'm working on the half, so I can stop things at the guide. So I want to introduce you guys to another tool, the cut tool. It looks like scissors over here in the toolbar, but you can also access it through C on the keyboard. So I'm going to hit C and find that anchor point in the middle. I'm going to trim that. And I'm also going to highlight over where it intersects the path underneath. I should see that in the display here. It should say intersect, and I click that, and I can delete the portion that I don't need. Okay, so that gives me that line there. I can do the same thing, right? Instead of starting in the middle, I'll start off to the side, and I can kind of scale this as needed. Snap that to the center. I'm holding Shift to drag down. And that looks like it's pretty close to my original line there that I have in my sketch. So I'll use that cut tool again. One thing to keep in mind when you're using the cut tool is you should have the object selected that you want to cut. So if I have this selected and I highlight my intersecting lines, here I'm going to cut that object, which is what I want. If I don't have that selected, if I have cut, right, if I have scissors highlighted, I can cut any line. I'm not really sure what I'm going to cut. It should default to the one that's on the top, but you could accidentally cut like my silhouette line if I have this highlighted here, right? If I do that, I think it did make that cut there, but you could envision cutting the wrong line, right? So again, it'll default to the shape that's on the top, but make sure you have it selected just to kind of prevent any confusion, right? So I can cut that there, I can cut that there, and I have the line segment that I need. Okay. If I want to do a part break and show that there's a little bit of a gap or a groove or offset, I can select this line and go to Object, Path, Offset Path, and you can see that it creates offsets to either side of the line. You can control the offset by how many points or pixels you are offsetting it. So I'm hitting 2 and then Tab to update that, and that looks pretty good. Maybe 3 would be a little bit more dramatic. I hit OK. And I can create an intersection here of these lines. So I can hit cut again. I highlight that anchor point. I highlight that anchor point. I can delete that. And then I can intersect these two, again, using the cut tool. Hover over, intersect, cut that away. Highlight that, cut that. And now I have these two line segments that are not joined at the moment, but I can join them just by highlighting there, and then Control J on PC, Command J on Mac, or Object, Path, and Join. Right? Now they are connected, which is great. This doesn't look quite long enough to intersect my silhouette, so I can drag that up. That looks pretty good. And I may leave that there. All right, looking down at some other features. I can use the pen tool to continue on, I'm holding Shift to create a smooth transition horizontally and make that feature there. Fine tune it. I can hold Alt and drag down. I'm holding Shift so that it locks to the vertical, so I can drag that down. Change these proportions because it looks like it thins out a little bit towards the exterior. That looks pretty good. I hit V on the keyboard to select that object, C on the keyboard to cut, delete that, C on the keyboard to cut, delete that. And I have those two shapes. Right now they're independent line segments, but I can join them. I like to drag over here just to work on them without intersecting my silhouette line over there. And I can just connect them with a simple line and then drag it back into place. It should snap at that guide, right? So you can see that that doesn't really affect my silhouette there, but now they are connected, which will be handy in our next video. And then I can take a look at my design and ask myself, did I capture everything that is symmetric, right? Everything before the reflection. And I think that I did. I have this flip top, I have the scoop over here, I have this accent, which could be a different color break or different material break. And then these designs are not symmetric. They have these kind of wavy grooves going down, and I have text over here. So I have everything that I need that I want to reflect. So I'll go here, Object Selection Tool, or V on the keyboard, select everything. And then to do a reflection, you can do it two ways. You can go to Object, Transform, and Reflect, and that will reflect about the origin, and you'll just want to do Copy and then drag that over. And that works fine. But you can also reflect it using hotkeys. And I like to do this way because you can reflect around a guide or an anchor point. So if I hit O on the keyboard, that is the hotkey for reflection. Don't know why, but O to reflect, you see the cursor changes, and I'm going to hold Alt and highlight over the anchor point. You see these three dots come up on the cursor. I'm highlighting the anchor point, so I'm reflecting about an anchor point. So in this dialog, I'm reflecting across the vertical or a vertical axis. You can see that that is the result there. And I can do copy. If you see what happens when you do horizontal, you reflect across a horizontal line or horizontal axis and it goes up, which is not what we want. So vertical, copy, and there we go. We've got a symmetric design. I can join these, going down the line here. You may need to hide the guide to do this. Sometimes it interrupts this operation, but that looks like that worked fine. And I can highlight that whole silhouette, right? That whole thing shows up. Great. Okay, so moving on. To make these grooves, I'm going to use the pen tool again. I'm going to click on my silhouette because I want to make sure it goes up to the edge. And in this case, I'm going to deviate from my sketch a little bit because I want this feature to show up on the bottom of the bottle. I don't want it to cross into the cap. And I click and hold on the other side and try to get this shape with these handles. Might take a little readjusting to get something that looks attractive. Okay. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to zoom out just a bit. I'm going to hold Alt and drag that down, though I do have some repositioning I need to do. So that didn't work perfectly because of the geometry that we have. So I'm going to readjust, get things back on the silhouette, and then adjust the shape. I want these to have the right kind of thin to thick relationship. Okay, that looks pretty good. And then one more time. Object selection, holding Alt, dragging down, and then put that back into place. All right. Looks pretty good. All right, I can check my work by turning off my underlay and seeing what those transitions look like. That looks pretty good. Okay, so the next part in my design is I want to show some, I want to show that these are grooved, that they're actually indented into the bottle. So I want to break my silhouette here, but I want to break it in a way that doesn't segment the line. If you recall, when we use cut, that actually breaks the path, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is select my line, click and hold on my pen tool over here, and I want to add an anchor point. So what I'm going to do while I have this selected is I'm going to add an anchor point at the top of that section, at the bottom of that section, and then in the middle as well. So I'm going to do one at first, just to play with this a little bit. I can drag the one that's in the middle either out to show a ridge or in to show an indentation. And by default, by adding an anchor point in here, it's going to make it smooth. You can change that by either going to convert up here, converting that to smooth, or just dragging this handle back into the anchor point. So I'm going to do that because I want it to be a sharper transition here. I think that'll add a little bit better definition and look maybe a little bit more realistic. Okay, so I've shown you how to do one of them. I'll go ahead and quickly do the others. So I have it selected with the object tool, add anchor point. I already have one there, so I don't need another one. One there, one there. Hit A for the anchor point selection tool, drag that in. Bring my handles back to the anchor point. And fine tune. Looks pretty good. Now I'll do the other side. I'm going to do this all at once here just to save some time. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, that looks pretty good. And there we go. I'll zoom out just to see how this is looking. It looks a little sharp. So what I might do is go back and soften this up just a little bit by bringing that in. Changing those grooves. I think this can be a little bit more subtle than what I had. These don't bother me too much. I might just nudge this one over. With anchor points, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge, move things slightly. If you can't get what you're doing, if you can't get what you want with the trackpad or the mouse. All right, so that looks pretty good. And last thing I'll show you guys is doing text on a curve. So normally when you do text, you can hit T on the keyboard, and that'll highlight the text tool. You can click and release and start writing text. But I have this kind of curved design, which I like. So what this requires is pen tool to give you a path. All right, so that looks pretty good. And the length of it doesn't really matter because you'll start at one point of that curve. So if I hit T again and hover over my path, you can see that my cursor changes and it says path. If I click on that, I can start typing along that path. So hit caps lock, shampoo, right? Highlight my text, and I can change my font to something more interesting. Right, so let me take something I used earlier and make it larger. You can also center it on your path, right justify. All right, so centered seems good. All right, check your work. Make sure things are looking how you want it to look. You could use this as an opportunity to save your file. Last thing I'm going to do is just vary the line weight a little bit. So with this exercise, it may be helpful to add some bolder line weights to certain areas. So the silhouette might be a good idea to bold that out, or wherever you might have some kind of part break. If you don't want entire segments bolded like this, right? Like maybe I don't want this area, but I do want this area. You could either segment the line or hit A over here, click on the line segment that you want to duplicate. I'm going to hold Shift because I want to grab that too. And Control C, Control V, and move that back into place. You can also do Edit and Paste in place. There it goes. And you can thicken just that portion of it. So maybe I can show that this is a part that is overhanging into that scoop or that recess a little bit. So that looks good. I'm going to do the same thing down here. With A, I click on this line segment, copy, edit, paste in place to there. So I can show that that cap, this accent might be part of that cap. All right, so that's about it for part one here of doing black and white line work in Illustrator and tracing a sketch that you've done by hand. In part two, we'll do some coloring and some gradients to give this some photorealistic rendering. So thank you for watching.